Hello, everyone. This is Jill Jarecki, the Chief Scientific Officer at Cure SMA. Thank you for joining this webinar today, which is a partnership between Cure SMA and Biogen. During the webinar, you'll hear from representatives at Biogen about their clinical trial Respond. These presentations are an opportunity for the SMA community to hear more about clinical trials that might be right for them and hear firsthand about the study design and goals. Of note, as with most of our webinars, the information shared is intended for US audiences only. Also, we are excited to have some good questions submitted in advance of this webinar and believe that many of these questions will be answered as part of the presentation, while a few others will be addressed during the designated Q&A session later in the call. We don't expect this webinar to go the full hour today, but hope it provides exciting and new information for you. If there are further questions after the presentation and Q&A, you can share them as part of your follow-up survey or by emailing webinar@curesma.org. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Anna Yalin from Biogen to kick off the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to provide information about Biogen's Respond study. Next slide, please. So as part of the webinar today, we will go through a brief overview of nusinersen, also known as Spinraza, and the rationale for conducting the Respond study. We will also share the Respond study overview and timeline, and following this, there will be time to answer some questions that we received from the community. Next slide, please. Nusinersen was approved by the FDA in December 2016 for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy in pediatric and adult patients. The approved dose is 12 milligrams, and it is delivered via intrathecal administration with 4 loading doses, followed by maintenance doses every 4 months. Russell, my colleague, will now take you through the rationale for the Respond study. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Anna. As mentioned, I will now review the rationale or reasons for conducting the Respond study. Next slide. So why is Biogen conducting the Respond study? There are 3 main reasons for this. Number 1, nusinersen has a different mechanism of action and route of administration than gene therapy. Each therapy may affect the same cell or different cells in a specific way. Number 2, it has been reported that some patients who receive gene therapy have subsequently been treated with nusinersen. Number 3, the Respond study is part of Biogen's continued commitment to help address the needs of the community and provide additional data to inform treatment decisions. Next slide. The goal of the FDA-approved SMA treatments is to address SMN protein deficiency and preserve motor neurons to improve health outcomes. The mechanism of action of nusinersen is illustrated on the left. Nusinersen is an antisense oligonucleotide that targets the SMN2 pre-messenger ribonucleic acid, or pre-mRNA. This results in an increased proportion of SMN2 messenger RNA transcripts that include exon 7, which can then be translated into functional, full-length SMN protein. The figure on the right illustrates the mechanism of action of the gene therapy onasemnogene abeparvovec. With gene therapy, a functional copy of the SMN1 gene is packaged in a part of the adeno-associated virus 9 called the AAV9 vector. It is delivered into the blood by a single intravenous injection. The vector eventually delivers the SMN1 gene to the nucleus of the motor neuron, which is instructed to produce SMN protein. Next slide. SMA therapies have the potential to target untreated motor neurons. Different therapies may treat the same cell type or different cell types differently. The amount of SMN protein production from either therapy may differ, and there is urgency in treating the motor neurons, as once they are lost, they cannot be replaced. This leads to the hypothesis that SMA treatments may impact different motor neurons, and that there is potential for increased SMN production and improved clinical outcomes when therapy 1 is followed by therapy 2. Next slide. We will now walk through an overview of the RESPOND study itself. Next slide. The objective of this study is to examine the clinical benefits and assess the safety of Spinraza in infants and children who have previously received onasemnogene abeparvovec and have demonstrated a suboptimal response. This will be an approximately 2-year open-label study that will be conducted in approximately 20 sites around the world. The goal is to enroll about 60 participants who will have their first dose of nusinersen by a maximum age of 36 months. Within the group of 60 participants, there will be a primary group of 40 participants who meet additional inclusion criteria, such as being 9 months old or younger at the time of their first nusinersen dose. Participants must be diagnosed with SMA and treated with gene therapy prior to inclusion into the study. A minimum of 3 months is required between gene therapy and the first nusinersen dose in the study. Each participant will receive the standard approved nusinersen dosing, which includes 4 loading doses given on days 1, 15, 29, and 64, followed by a total of 5 maintenance doses, 1 dose given every 4 months. Anna will now take you through some of the enrollment and study specifics. Next slide.
Thanks, Russell. So who is eligible to enroll in the study? The key inclusion criteria for all participants include the following. They must have received onasemnogene abeparvovec prior to enrollment, must not have previously received nusinersen, must be 36 months old or younger at the first time of the first nusinersen dose, and the investigator must have identified that the participant has a suboptimal clinical status, or in other words, the participant has room for additional improvement. The investigator will determine the suboptimal clinical status of the patient, which can be characterized by not being able to perform as well as expected on some motor function assessments, requiring respiratory support, having an abnormal swallowing or feeding ability for the patient's age, or any other suboptimal clinical status that the investigator has noticed. The participant must have suboptimal clinical status in at least one of these 4 categories. Next slide, please. As Russell mentioned earlier, the goal is to enroll approximately 60 participants, 40 of whom will be part of a primary group, which has these additional inclusion criteria. They must have 2 copies of the SMN2 gene. The patient's symptoms must begin by 4 months of age and prior to receiving the gene therapy. The patient must have received gene therapy by 6 months of age. And finally, the patient must receive nusinersen in the study by 9 months of age. The remaining 20 of the 60 participants will be part of a broader group with less restrictive inclusion criteria. So they don't have to meet the inclusion criteria of the primary group. They can be up to 36 months of age at the time of the first nusinersen dose in the study, and they have to have a minimum of only 1 copy of the SMN2 gene. Some key exclusion criteria for all participants in both groups include history of acute liver failure or acute liver injury requiring hospital admission, the use of steroids for liver injury within 1 month prior to first dose of nusinersen in the study, and permanent ventilation, defined as a tracheostomy or 16 or more hours of ventilation per day continuously for 21 or more days in the absence of an acute reversible event. Next slide, please. So what will the RESPOND study measure? The primary endpoint will be the total motor milestone score as measured by section 2 of the Hammersmith Infant Neurological Examination, or the HINE. Some of the key secondary and exploratory endpoints include the following listed here. So incidence of adverse events or serious adverse events during the treatment period, change from baseline in clinical lab parameters, ECGs and vital signs, World Health Organization, WHO, motor milestones, and change from baseline in other motor function assessments, such as the CHOP-INTEND or the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Infant Test of Neuromuscular Disorders, the HFMSE or the Hammersmith Scale, and the Revised Upper Limb Module or the RULM. We will also be studying neurofilament and biomarker levels and the ability of the participants to thrive. Please note, this is not an exhaustive list. Next slide, please. So to recap, the study duration is approximately 2 years and will include 1 screening visit, 9 treatment visits, and 1 follow-up visit. All study participants will receive nusinersen, the study drug, and study-related care and monitoring. There may be reimbursement for eligible travel and other related study expenses as well. Next slide, please. As we mentioned earlier, we will be conducting the study at approximately 20 sites globally, and we currently have 3 sites already open and enrolling at Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters in Norfolk, Virginia, Arkansas Children's Hospital in Little Rock, and Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. We are continuing to add additional study locations over the coming year as well. So please check the clinicaltrials.gov website for ongoing updates about sites which are ready to evaluate and enroll study participants. I'm pleased to say in January 2021, the first participant in the study was dosed at the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters, and we estimate that enrollment will be completed by March 2023. Next slide, please. So thank you very much for joining us. Please remember to check clinicaltrials.gov for further information about the study and the sites that are open for enrollment. You may also email clinicaltrials@biogen.com for further inquiries. And I'll now turn you over to Leslie for the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Anna and Russell. We hope that we were able to answer a lot of the questions that were submitted in that presentation, but there are a few additional questions that we would like to address as part of our Q&A session here. And so I'm going to address the first question to Anna. The first question, next slide. We have, are any additional sites being recruited for Respond in addition to those that you mentioned?
So yes, there will be. As of today, the sites actively recruiting are the 3 that I just said. So the Children's Hospital of King's Daughters in Norfolk, Virginia, Arkansas Children's Hospital in Little Rock, and Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. But we are updating all recruiting sites in clinicaltrials.gov, and we'll also be able to access this page through the Respond study website, which is www.smarespondstudy.com, which will be live soon.
Great. The next question that we had is, I'm going to put toward Russell. What about treatment for SMA type 3?
Yes, great question. In Respond, the subjects must have a minimum of 1 SMN2 copy, and the maximum age at the first nusinersen dose is 36 months. So yes, type 3 subjects could be eligible as long as they have received onifemnogene abeparvovec and have demonstrated a suboptimal clinical response and meet all the other inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Great. And as a follow-on again to, who can be enrolled in the trial, the last question we have here is, can children treated pre-symptomatically with Zolgensma be enrolled in this Respond trial?
Yes, the answer is yes. Children who were pre-symptomatic prior to receiving gene therapy are eligible to participate in the study if they later develop symptoms and their healthcare provider determined that they had a suboptimal clinical response.
Great. Those were just a couple of questions that came in that we that weren't sort of addressed directly in the presentation. So I'm going to pass things back off to Dr. Jarecki to close things out.
So thank you to the Biogen team for taking the time to walk us through this important clinical trial. To the community on the phone, I hope you found this webinar about the RESPOND trial helpful. We will work to post this online in the coming weeks for those who could not attend the webinar live. And in the meantime, as we noted at the beginning, you will receive a follow-up survey about this webinar in the next day or so, and we very much welcome your feedback. Thank you again for your time and have a good day.